American Christianity and the American Revolution, the two concepts are truly tied together. If we look at Thomas Kidding's uh, God of Liberty, in his chapter 3, the um, section really focuses a little bit on the Quebec Act, which, from um, perspective here, it shows that the ideals of the American Revolution, up until the Quebec Act, had really been personified as um, tolerable up until the Quebec Act. That the new concepts of the economic perspectives and political um, freedoms that had been taken up until that point had really been um, something that the American people had been able to endure. Um, it is when the Quebec Act, which frightens the American people, um, brings about this idea of spiritual and religious freedoms being taken from them. Americans, much like any other group of people, were more likely to suffer the changes of their form of government that had been set upon them. The Declaration of Independence clearly states that man, mankind are more likely, sorry, that mankind are more disposed to suffer when evil are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms for which they are accustomed, meaning we were more likely to maintain our government and to continue on the same path of which we were in. Um, the challenge of that, though, is that with the Quebec Act, we get into this concept of religious ideals and freedoms. Now, when we think of the ventures that bring us here to the colonies to begin with, specifically the New England colonies, um, religious practices and religious freedoms were secured in a highly important concepts of what we were doing. As Kidd stated in his chapter, the Pope, the devil, and their emissaries, it was ludicrous to believe that anyone to believe that the crown would have tried to force Catholicism on the colonies, but the endurance for the colonies and the colonists were clearly unsure. Through these fears, though these fears were unfounded, the colonists took this image very seriously and took this threat very seriously. And for many, they saw this as the last straw and the tipping point of the conflict, that it had to be resolved in order for there to be a lasting peace in the colonies. Even at the conclusion of the war and the establishment of the Second Constitution, the Constitution of the United States, over the Articles of Confederation, in order to have that Constitution pass, the First Amendment concept of freedom of religion is clearly stated in that. Without that establishment of the freedom of religion, there would not be a passage of the Constitution. Although this is not the only process of the Constitution, it is clearly an overreaching factor that is evident in the colonies. An even greater concept, though, thinking of the American Revolution, is the concept that America itself and Americans themselves see this much like they had already endured it as a test from God. Much like suffering that had happened at Plymouth or Jamestown, the Revolution was another trial that the American people had to stand through. If they ever wanted to reach their religious ideals that they were holding on to in this time frame, it was their belief that their own religious and moral values that sustained them beyond the demands of Valley Forge and the winters that followed in 1778, that they would truly need to withstand and endure whatever God had put them through. They truly believed that it was by the grace of God and God alone that they were going to make it through and by the extension win the war.